here in the library to be celebrating a diversity that is just extraordinary that you see that this Jaipur festival has come to symbolize. And this panel has changed a couple of times. It started off, I first thought, as House of Cards, and then it moved to Game of Thrones, and now we're doing something which I think is much more symbolic of the democratic experience, which is backstories and how everyone came to be and what everyone is feeling at this moment. So what better place to celebrate diversity and democracy with this extraordinary platoon that is on the stage, and I'm honored to be with you all. First, Andrew Lam spent his boyhood in Vietnam as the son of a general and came into California as one of the first Vietnamese refugees. 5 books later, he has won a PEN Award.
3. but I am working on 2 more.
And captivated NPR audiences with his insightful commentaries. So, the ultimate refugee success story. Take that, Donald Trump. And we have Matt Applebaum, Boulder's former mayor, who won his election in a squeaker, 1 vote.
For me, just for me.
Mr. Former Mayor, you are a Brooklyn boy turned Boulder Politico, and who better to reflect on how lives are made and remade in this country. We love your city, and it's wonderful that you all are hosting us. And this, as we know, is the year of the women. So let me introduce my friend Ruchira Gupta. Ruchira, you have done so much in India and around the world to highlight the desperate problems of women who have no voice in the society. At your center in Bihar, which is, by the way, a former Gupta family house, you rehabilitate women who have been trafficked. When we first met a decade ago, we learned that we had both written about a Bombay rescuer who was later murdered by a member of a trafficking mafia. Now Ruchira is all over America campaigning for Hillary Clinton, and she will be telling us about that in a few minutes. So, a few ideas before we plunge in. This week I had a kind of interesting experience that's worth sharing. I've been doing a lot of work on extremism, and I've been interviewing tech people who study models of how extremists get into Facebook and what this looks like. And he showed me some of his modeling exercises that he's working on. And he opened up a screen, and the first screen was how our population looked to someone who does this a year or 2 ago. And what I saw was what looked like a Jackson Pollock. All these tiny dots of color of different clusters of opinions around the country, but none of it coagulated into blobs. It was like pretty sort of diverse and all over the place. Then he pressed a button and he showed me a screen that he had done just a week ago about how America is looking for him right now in terms of opinions on extremism. And what I saw was a version that looked like 2 barbells, where a lot of these dots had come together in polarities, that we are such a divided, fractious country. As we all know, we're all in a kind of echo chamber moment where we're all hearing our own opinions. So this morning at the breakfast table, who do I see but Andrew? And we immediately got into this conversation. And Andrew, can you share, to start off, the very first thing you said to me this morning when I said, oh my God, you're Andrew Lam, you're on my panel today, help.
Well, I say that, well, thank you for attending and thank you for inviting me. The first thing I said was I'm a little bit distraught that on Facebook I have to unfriend people. And it's not something I want to do, and it's actually unfriending people that you kind of know makes it even more embarrassing and difficult. But the kind of political climate that we are in at this point leads to a lot of emotional responses that people regret later. And you know, I usually don't unfriend people until they start attacking me and my other friends, and then you constantly have to defend yourself to a point where you say, this is not working out, I just can't keep doing this. But then it occurs to me that this is the problem of the polarization, because increasingly there is no safe space in which this kind of opposition, this different point of view can be shared without this divisiveness. And it makes it difficult because, on the other hand, on Facebook, all the people who post tend to agree with each other politically anyway, and then it's like preaching to the choir. You're not changing mindset so much as kind of like you say an echo chamber or agreeing with each other, when in fact what we need at this point is a kind of cultural political space in which people can understand each other from different political background and spectrum, and I feel like that's not happening.
But I'm so curious, and I'm sure everyone else is too, why have you been attacked? And how, can you tell us a little bit about who's attacking you and why?
Well, I mean, you know, I just posted, you know, Nate Silver's, you know, something like, you know, the stats right after the DNC convention when there was a bounce, and I say, wow, there is hope and da-da-da. And then people who were Trump fans started attacking me for saying this is hope because she should go to prison, that sort of thing. You know, the kind of rhetoric. And
what were some of the, do you remember some of the specific things that were said to you?
Well, you know, like you know, for a journalist, I'm not, I'm biased. For a journalist, you know, I should keep my opinion to myself. Never mind, this is my homepage. But anyway, it's kind of like your kind of virtual living room, when people tell you like how to behave in your virtual living room. It's a very different space, but still, it's that kind of. I mean, I imagine that wouldn't happen if I were to sit down with that person in a more friendly situation at a dining table and then discuss it. But it's somehow this corrosive attitude. It seems to be very, it's sort of like internet rage, you know, like road rage. People feel like they can say anything, but it leads to disagreement and resentment rather than actual discussion. I don't really see chat room in which people take time to say, well, that's an interesting point, but what have you thought of? It's like by the third line is like, F you, go home, you know? So it becomes really divisive online for some reason.
And it's all the more startling when you learn a bit about Andrew's astonishing arrival in America and his own childhood and how he was reared. Andrew, tell us a little about this. You haven't yet written about this.
No, well, I mean, I was an army brat. My father was in the military, so I saw a lot of fighting, but you know, a very complicated colonial, post-colonial background in which my father was a French citizen, educated. But
your father was, it was like an aristocratic general. He was sort of like running, he was like, sort of like, he was one of the leaders of
yeah, he was a three-star general in the South Vietnamese army, but he was French educated, and he, at one point when the French were defeated, he had an option of going back to France to become poor, like, you know, or stay in Vietnam and struggle for remake of that country, and he decided to stay. But I think the most important thing about my relationship with my father via this talk about democracy is that he's the first one who introduced to me at a very young age the idea of democracy, and democracy which was fledgling in South Vietnam and then died a painful death. But that it's not just about voting, but it's about the idea of having opposed positions and allowed to exist in that space. And it allowed me to disagree with my father at a dining table, which is not something that Asians tend to do in a Confucius-bound society where you have to respect and obey and say, I disagree with you, create tension in the household, which of course does create tension when I say that to my father, but it was understood that there is such thing as you can have different ideas. You know, and that was important, and so, you know, the idea, the democratic idea is not just that you go to vote and then go home, do your own thing, but that you create a civic space, you create participation on a local level in which, you know, you change the outcome locally as well. And so, you know, that to me was always instilled in me.
But your father's remarkable. I mean, he would take you into war zones when you were 8, 9, and 10. And then tell us a little bit about your escape in the helicopter and what happened to you when you arrived in America. Because I think it's an amazing kind of American moment.
Well, I think there is a movie about this. It's called Last Days in Saigon or something like this. And I watched that film and I felt like I'm actually in that film, although you can't find me, but I'm one of those people that the embassy actually arranged to get out, and then we basically got into a kind of secret hideout, and then waited until early morning to get into this plane, and then took off. And the moment we took off, about an hour later, they bombed the airport. This is why helicopters came later, is because airplanes couldn't take off anymore from the runway. So then we ended up airlifted to Guam, to Hamilton, no, to what is that, Subic Bay, and then from there to Guam, where American soldiers were hastily bulldozing ground in the army structure area so that they can put up tent. And we had to wait for the tent to be put up because basically there weren't enough tents. So I went from this privileged kid to a homeless kid within about a day and a half.
To like a boat kid coming in from, and then, but you come to an America that's very different from the America that we have right now for refugees.
Yeah, I mean, the America that welcomed me was a very different America than the America now, because there is this, it's kind of odd, you know, to be Vietnamese in 1975 to America was to be somewhat popular in a very odd way, because a lot of kids watch TV, and Walter Cronkite basically brought Vietnam to their TV living room every night, even though it's bad news. But I was not from Sri Lanka, I was not from Nepal, where people didn't know anything about it. I was from this country in which people's relatives or cousins or had someone had fought there or died there. So they were full of questions. So I was somewhat of a kind of strangely popular kid, because they here is someone from the rice field in the black and white TV emerging, you know, into the classroom, and so.
And I love the story of your incredible teacher. I mean, you were a boy who really didn't even speak English. You spoke French and Vietnamese. And what was the first book you read in English?
So, okay, I'm sure this has to do with democracy, but I think it will.
It does, completely, it does.
Yeah, but the first book was The Wind in the Willow, and my English teacher wanted me to you know, learn English, and so that was his first gift to me. And I remember being so excited because I read a lot of books in Vietnamese and French when I was a kid, but I couldn't read the English book. So I remember rushing out with like 40 or 50 cents back then, and went to this beat up old store where they have used things, and I bought a typewriter. And for that summer, my first summer in America, I read my first English language book, The Wind in the Willow, and typed the whole thing out as well. So I emerged as a typist as well as a reader of an English novel.
This is why you have written 3 incredibly, brilliantly reviewed, award-winning books, and on to those 2 more that I've already had you having written. Now, Matt, I find your story so intriguing.
Yeah, that's going to be hard to follow. I mean,
well, okay, imagine this.
Brooklyn's a weird place, but it's not quite. I wasn't.
So what neighborhood in Brooklyn did you grow up in?
Sheepshead Bay.
Sheepshead Bay. Okay, so I imagine you. Matt and I spoke on the phone a little bit this morning, and he said, "I'm like you. I'm from Brooklyn." I said, "I'm from South Texas, thank you." He said, "You sound like you're from New York."
Somebody told me you were from New York.
But, so this is like, everyone has such an interesting backstory that's looking under the surface. And as Matt, you told me yours, I imagine you on a convertible coming from Sheepshead Bay to Boulder.
Hardly.
Okay, so tell, how did you come to Boulder and to get into politics?
This really is going to be tough to I'm going to have to make these things up as I go along here to make it a little more dramatic. I don't know how to do that quite. No, it's really not that exciting, although I am here quite accidentally. And I suspect a lot of people in Boulder got here somewhat accidentally. I mean, for me, it's just when I got out of grad school, my real life, I'm a computer scientist, or was one, back when my brain cells still worked, and they stopped working a long time ago. But and I kind of designed software systems. But when I got out of grad school in the mid-'70s, there just really weren't any jobs. I poked around for a bit, and I was going to head to the West Coast, where I had some friends who, of course, were in the computer software biz, and if I had gone there, I'd now be a multi-billionaire, and I wouldn't be sitting here, and I'd own an island someplace, and life would be really good because I would have joined some company and made a fortune. But I didn't do that, and I didn't really want to go there. I had a friend from college who was in Boulder, and she had just gotten hired by a very unlikely outpost of Bell Labs. Those of you who know about Bell Labs, at the time, they actually had an outpost in the Denver area, not doing research, but doing practical stuff. And she was the first person they hired in years. And I became the second person they hired. And then I stayed. Politics was a little unlikely. I'd always been interested in politics, but I think growing up in New York, you have to be interested in politics because it's such a bizarre place. But I was never.
You jumped in on a local level, on a very small local.
Well, yeah. I mean, in New York, you really, first of all, I was a kid, and secondly, it's impossible to get involved. In Boulder, it was relatively easy to get involved, first in some neighborhood issue, and then kind of the usual one thing led to another. But it's always been on the local level, and that finally gives me a chance to maybe follow up on the theme, which is it's totally different at the local level than it is at certainly the national level, but even at the state level. It's not that everybody loves everybody else, and it's not that there aren't angry people. Come to a council meeting some Tuesday night, and I assure you, you'll find some angry people. But at the local level, the conversation is just different, especially in a city our size. I mean, I've never done this in a city the size of New York, but in a city our size, well, you actually can get to know people, and as you say, you can talk to them as opposed to just having battles going back on the internet. There's just a different feel to it, and you also just need to get things done. You can't play games forever and not accomplish anything. You actually have to get real things done in the real world for real people, and it's a very different way of doing things. And even regionally, where, as you would imagine, Boulder has some disagreements with other communities in the region, people basically get along and learn to work with each other. That starts not working so well when you get to the state level, and then completely stops working 100% when you get to the national level, as we've seen.
Yes, so here's our moment to think about where we are now and this particular season that many of us are calling the autumn before the dark. And I think for many of us, one of the most astonishing moments this summer was watching Khizr Khan, with his eloquence in front of the Democratic Convention, take that Constitution out of his pocket and wave it at the idea of Trump and what he has come to represent. And I thought about that moment later. You know, I've spent much time in South Asia, and I'm sure many of you have as well. And I thought, this is such an extraordinary moment on so many levels for America, because our country, which is often so jingoistic, is seeing what is possible in this immigrant experience for someone coming from this really quite educated, getting his education in America, but coming from quite a good background in Pakistan, coming into this country, rising to become a lawyer, becoming this, you know, just noble Gold Star father, and this kind of extraordinary situation. And it's just sort of the ultimate success story of what a South Asian can be on so many levels, and then, of course, the Shakespearean tragedy which attaches to that. So, Ruchira, on to you. You have given voice to so many people in South Asia, and you work in one of the poorest states in India, Bihar. How did you come to this? Tell us, your backstory is just extraordinary.
So I used to be a journalist 20 years ago, and I was walking through the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages which didn't have any girls from age 15 to 40. And I began to ask the men playing cards and drinking tea, where the girls were, and the answer changed my life, because I found that a smooth supply chain existed from those villages to the brothels of Bombay. And in my lifetime, in my country, in my generation, what I later began to call modern day slavery existed.
Can all of you hear Ruchira? Can you put the microphone just a little bit closer? Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I think I have to hold it up, then it goes down. And there were girls between the ages of 9 and 13 who were being transported to the brothels of Bombay and sold for $100, $150 to be locked up for the next 5 years and raped repeatedly 8 or 10 times a night for 30 cents each rape. And I ended up making a documentary on the subject, won an Emmy for outstanding investigative journalism, but it all seemed irrelevant and I felt I had to do something about it. So I quit journalism and started a small grassroots organization called Apne Aap in Bombay with the 22 women who had told the story. And that's how my story began. And
this was very early on. I mean, this was what, about 2005, 4 that you were doing this?
I made the documentary in 1996, almost
so even
20
earlier.
years.
Yes.
And I got a lot of help. You know, the interesting thing is that when I wanted to shift from journalism to start being an activist and doing something about it, it was a coincidence, but I met Mrs. Clinton's aides in New York at the UN where my film was being screened. And through them I got to meet Mrs. Clinton and I began to tell them that this was like the most urgent problem of our time. And managed to actually work with 2 senators, bipartisan, Republican and Democrat, Paul Wellstone and Sam Brownback, and get the first law on trafficking passed in the United States by testifying to the US Senate, even before I could do it in my own country. And then use the power and influence of here to affect change in my own country in terms of laws and policies while doing the grassroots work. So I began to see the interdependence of global cultures very clearly in my own life, and you know, which is why when Marie introduced me and said that I'm campaigning for Hillary, that's why. Because I feel that there's going to have a huge impact, not just on people like you who come into America, but to all of us all over the world, really.
And in Ruchira's film, isn't there a scene where you're in the brothels of Bombay and we see the girls are hidden in the ceiling and that one of the police go in a raid and they pull down a ceiling tile and out tumble about 6 Nepalese young women who have been trafficked. And when you see this, it just takes your breath away. This particular area is about a 15-minute walk from the Taj Hotel, the best hotel in India, if not all of South Asia. And I remember when we started working and reporting, I was this was about a decade ago, outraged by this. And I went out to dinner with an industrialist in Bombay, and I was telling him this, and he looked at me and I said, why aren't you doing something about it? I mean, he lived right in this area in the Oberoi Hotel. And he said, this is their destiny. And you couldn't change the mindset. You could not. And Ruchira, how did you go about getting this kind of private, public, this is an ongoing problem to change this mindset, even in the leadership class?
2 ways, Marie, as you know. One was girl by girl. So through my own NGO, I began to show that prostituted women wanted to exit and they could do other things. It wasn't inevitable. Get their daughters into school and file cases against traffickers. And as that happened, people began to feel that something was possible and it wasn't destiny. The other thing that I did do was build friends and allies inside US, in America, in India, and also inside the United Nations, Philippines, very close to Subic Bay. I've been there too. And there's a huge red light area both in Patpong and Subic Bay, left over by soldiers who made a war. And through the friends and allies, I was able to actually influence laws and policies, which I began to see were the right policies by listening to the most marginalized girl in the brothel and then taking it to Milan Vervia, who was Hillary's aide, or taking it to Hillary Clinton and seeing how could we change laws. And that, bridging that from the bottom to the top, but change beginning at the bottom, really, really made a big difference. And today, not just the US law, but we've managed to change the UN protocol. We've created a UN protocol to end trafficking, which has then led to 110 countries all over the world changing their laws. Sweden, Norway, France have created really good laws on trafficking, and I've gone and testified there on behalf of survivors. And inside the US, we have got a good federal law, but the laws in the states are still uneven. So we keep going state by state trying to change laws, basically to shift the blame from the victims to the perpetrators.
The statistics are all over the board about how many women are actually trafficked. In the United States, I've read estimates, which I think are high and put out by NGOs that are looking for contributions. They're way over 100,000. What do you think the real, I mean, any number is too high, 50 is too high, but what do you think the closer to the number is, the closest number?
It's impossible, but you know, we can only project based on what we see, and through shared statistics between NGO, media, Interpol, FBI, State Department people, UN people, and they say that it's now the second largest organized crime in the world, following the arms or the drug trade, and it keeps switching because this is growing, and there are billions of dollars to be earned because a girl or a man can be sold again and again. And inside the US, people say that about 250,000 women and girls are trafficked every year, and this is a Department of Justice data. And the average age of a girl being pulled into prostitution here is between 13 and 15. And, you know, a girl could be recruited on a railway station in Brooklyn and pimped for the next 3 years in a basement somewhere. And there's something called the Minnesota pipeline, where blonde, blue-eyed girls are brought into New York on a regular basis. So it's a huge crime right here, and it's not in Congo. Congo is here.
So, you know, you wonder how this could be going on in the United States, and this is a moment in the world where, you know, in the headlines every day we're reading about change agents and the changes that are happening, the rise of nationalism in Europe. In India, you watched the ultimate change agent get elected. What are we seeing? What are we seeing between Brexit and what's going on this year? Are we oblivious to a larger segment of conversation that we have been unaware of that is causing this to happen? Andrew, what do you think?
Wow, it's a big question.
I know.
Well, I think there has always been a backlash to the whole idea of globalization. I mean, fundamentalism is a reaction in a way because you don't want change, you don't want the world around you to change. But also, I think it's inevitable that the borders will remain porous, even if there is beefing up or even this threat of a wall. People will move. I mean, human history is about movement, so that's not going to stop. But I think when a country is unwilling to deal with the reality of the shifting demographic, is that it tends to be more draconian and its reaction tend to be more cruel. But in every country I've been to, there are all kind of migration that happens, even as isolated as Japan. I did a whole series of interviewing with people who are undocumented there. And I'm like, how did you get here? You know, and they say, oh, I jumped off a ship and I swam in. I stayed and I couldn't go home, but I'm making money. So I mean, even though there is this this anti-immigrant expectation in Japan, there is large enclave as well. So it's not as if with Brexit, England is going to stop having immigrants, or that the population would somehow turn back to completely white population, which probably didn't happen because I'm actually reading a book in which the loyalists who were defeated in the American Civil War, actually, many of them were free slaves and were actually accepted back into England, which they'd never been to. And there were black who lived there since then. So, you know, there is no whiteness, you know, there's always some kind of movement in which demographic shift will happen.
And Matt, we were talking this morning about Boulder as a kind of interesting case study because your city has very low, you know, very few minorities. I'd like to hear what do you think about this notion of the change agent and this turmoil that we see in every country all over the world right now?
Yeah, that is a tough question. And living in the Boulder bubble, it's really a tough question to answer. I do get out once in a while. They let me out every now and then. But they don't let me go very far usually. And I don't know, how many of you live in Boulder? Just curious.
Wow.
A lot of them. All right, so look, we're lucky. We do live in the Boulder bubble. It's a wonderful place to live, but we certainly don't have much of a minority population. We're angry about certain things, although not necessarily about these sorts of issues. I mean, looking a little more broadly and from traveling, I guess I would just say kind of the obvious, that people are angry about a couple of things that are probably inevitable. One is that, or partly inevitable, we did it somewhat to ourselves, the first one, which is people's lives are not apparently getting better, at least for the bulk of people. You know, the so-called middle class, however on earth you feel like defining that, where we've come to believe it's always going to get better and things are going to get easier and we're going to get richer and we're going to go, you know, have our villa in the south of France or whatever. And lo and behold, that isn't happening. And it isn't happening for a huge number of reasons, including some decisions that have been made, including globalization, which I think is inevitable and isn't going to be undone just because somebody doesn't sign a trade agreement. I mean, that's ludicrous. It's not going away. So people are angry about that, whether rightfully or not, we can debate. I think there's a good reason to have some anger. Sadly, the anger seems to be directed in the wrong direction, which is quite remarkable. And the second thing is just demographic changes that people aren't comfortable with. People don't like change. Boulderites don't like change. So there's a place where we do have something in common with much of the rest of the world. We don't like change. We like things the way they are.
So before I jump to Ruchira, who's been out on the road with the Clinton campaign, I'm going to just take moderator's privilege and read you a tiny excerpt that a Scottish historian wrote, an ethicist wrote in the 1800s, and then ask you all on Ruchira to reflect on this. All right, this will depress you, just get ready. This is gloomy. Okay, so this is Alexander Fraser Tyler, was a Scottish ethicist in the late 1700s. He wrote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been about 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations always progress through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, apathy to fear, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back into bondage." Now, Ruchira.
That's real optimistic.
Yeah. Ruchira, you've been out on the campaign trail. Where have you been? What have you heard? And does this jive with your experience?
Yes, well, there is the wheel of history, and every nation goes through its own cycle. And I have been concentrating a lot on Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and trying to mobilize voters to think differently and understand what is at stake. Because I fear that just because there's anger for what could have been done and has not been achieved, people might actually vote in someone who will dismantle everything they know in their lives as they see it, from reproductive rights to social security, to food coupons and housing vouchers, to, of course, the treatment of refugees and new talent coming into America, the possibility of trade if new talent doesn't come in, how will that impact on jobs? So the very jobs that they are fighting for, the very lifestyle they are fighting for, could be impacted. And so that is the conversation I've been having, and telling people to choose not on the basis of what they think has not happened, but what do they want? And who will take a more rational decision to do that. And also look and go beyond the lies to actually look at what Hillary has done in the times that she's ever held office for women and children, because that's what I primarily deal with, and I have seen so much incremental change. And she moves slowly, she's not flamboyant, and she will again do things incrementally, I'm sure. You know, because as Secretary of State, one of the things people have not noticed is her big leadership on women's issues and how she has put that front and center. When I was in Calcutta, in the red light district, Hillary actually came to visit us in Calcutta as Secretary of State and met survivors of prostitution, which offered protection to the work I do from the very traffickers that you were talking about, who were hiding girls inside ceilings and they were tumbling out and being sold and bought and locked up in little rooms. So each thing has been incremental from the time that she spoke at the Beijing Women's Conference, if you remember, 1995, where she said women's rights are human rights. And nobody thought that till then. Nobody thought that till then. You know, most of us don't realize how much we've achieved. Domestic violence was considered life 20 years ago. So all the things we've achieved, we've forgotten, and we want something exactly what Matt was talking about, the rage as not having the good life, what Kim Kardashian represent, what the island in some ocean represents, the fast cars, but those are not real. Ultimately what people want is that their local place not to change, where they can get their basic needs met, and that is what Hillary is going to try and do because she's more rational.
Well, you know, putting it aside the candidates, are we looking at a larger trend of the rise of fascism in America? I've been reading, I've read twice this summer, Philip Roth's masterful The Plot Against America, which imagines, how many of you have read it? You know, it imagines America in 1940 if Charles Lindbergh had beaten Franklin Roosevelt, and what happens in this sort of season of fear over a 4-year period with Lindbergh as the president in a kind of alliance with the Germans. And it is so chilling, it's predictive, and so you know, you watch these poll numbers, and as you see these adoring crowds, whether they've been pumped up or not, for Donald Trump, you just wonder, where are we now in this country? Andrew, what you said something so interesting this morning about, you know, the revolutionary moment after the bondage. Just reflect on that a little bit with this summer of politics.
Well, I think when you quoted that this morning, I got more depressed than I usually am. and
that's my job, is to depress you all.
And I think I said something then after bondage revolution, because like you said, there is a routine thing that happened. Not routine then, it's a cyclical thing that happens to every state nation over history. But I'm not sure what that revolution might look like, because I can't be prophetic about it. But there definitely will be some kind of revolution regardless of who wins this time around. So it feels to me, because of that polarization is so extreme now that everyone seems to project a different America depending on whose side they're on, and the America that will be to come is not exactly the one that anyone's going to be actually going to have, because disappointment is also the nature of politics. And so then what is that revolution? I don't know, but it feels like we are at the cusp of something really, you know, I think, you know, from my camp, people think that if Hillary wins, then it will be business as usual, but my impulse to say is that probably not. That business as usual is not going to be coming so much as you know, dissent. There might even be more war, and that what we hope for will not come so much as you know, what we don't know what to expect will be on the horizon.
So when you were at Berkeley, you had a professor who talked to you a great deal and used a term that I loved,
Yeah.
the social compact.
Yeah. Well, the term he actually used is social capital. And that was one thing that I find really fascinating, because I remember reading about Kennedy and the famous quote, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. And it feels like watching the political debates, everyone is forced into this kind of passive role of spectator, rather than being somehow participatory in actual change of America. But what this candidate can do for you, or what this candidate can do or can't do for you, or do to you, rather than this whole idea that you work to change America on the grassroots level. And that impulse seems to not be part of the conversation these days, but like who you prefer or not who you don't prefer. But the social capital idea was that, you know, if you don't have enough money, your neighbor will help you cook so that you will have enough food for a wedding or a birthday. And if they're building a house, you come over and help them, put up a beam and a roof or something. And that sort of support create a kind of weaving of a social fabric. But it doesn't feel that's the case nowadays. And it feels more like everyone has their own opinions, but kind of isolated from one another. And it feels sad. It feels like that's not real what body politics at the ground level should be. It should be participatory and engaged, and instead we're just all kind of a spectator sport at this point.
So before we open to the audience, I want to ask each of you, if de Tocqueville were to come back to America in 2016 and get in his convertible and start traveling, Matt, what would he see? Or would he just say, give me my...
I think he'd leave.
Yeah, give me my hemlock.
I don't know. I mean, yes, I think he'd see a country that is definitely polarized at the moment, more so than we have been in quite a while. Although we've been through other periods where there's been a lot of anger and a lot of polarization. This is not the first time ever that's happened. And I don't know what he'd see. I mean, would he really see a sense that some of that social fabric has been lost or not? I mean, again, at the local level, I think you still see a lot of it, not just in the Boulder bubble.
We're hoping for optimism here.
But I think in a lot of places you see it. Again, when you kind of move up the chain, that's where that gets lost an awful lot. And you certainly are seeing people more, both where they live and how they get their information, of just kind of isolating themselves in many ways. I mean, you know, the studies that have been done, if you look at where people live or choose to live, insofar as people have a choice, and a lot of people do, we're kind of segregating ourselves, and not necessarily by race, but by politics.
And are we making false assumptions? There was such an interesting editorial, an op-ed in the Times this week, about how pollsters make leaping assumptions about people's racism without really understanding who the individual is. And they used Obama's case as an example of how his grandmother, who raised him and who was extraordinary, often, used words that he found unfortunate, or that a pollster might think it was implied that she was a racist, but of course she was the opposite of this, that she gave him an entire life. So are we making false assumptions based on projections that are wrong about social...
So one more thought about that, and this is just random crazy thinking, I'm sure, or hopeful thinking, and I wouldn't say I'm overly optimistic at the moment, but so Trump doesn't seem to be able to get above about 40% in polling. So that, would mean 4 in 10 of you, except remember, we're in the Boulder bubble, so nothing applies in the Boulder bubble. We have our magic shields up. But if you want to be somewhat optimistic, you'd have to think, sure, some number of those people, probably way too many of them, actually agree with what this crazy person is saying, but then probably some substantial number of people are just going to vote the party and don't actually believe that he'll do what he's saying. because it's hard to believe he'd do what he's saying. For one thing, he says different things every 5 minutes, so who knows what the heck he would do. And you know, you just have trouble believing somebody would be that loony. The problem with that, even if you're optimistic about that, is my guess is that's how other countries have ended up with people who really were scary and did a lot of damage, because people didn't believe they would do what they said they would do. And here we are in kind of that situation.
In a plot against America.
So, you know, are people gonna figure it out? Are people just gonna, you know, where are they gonna go? That's really hard to tell. You have to assume that when it gets a little closer, people will take a little more notice. And just one more thought about that, because there's an interesting article I read this morning that Clinton's biggest problem right now is with the millennials, who, yeah, it's easy for me to say should know better. They clearly totally dislike Trump, but they're not Clinton fans, and they're just kind of floating along in outer space somewhere as if this doesn't matter. So I'm not much of a student of history, but boy, the millennials should start reading up on their history.
Ruchira, how do you get those millennials out of the bubble?
I talked to them and basically explained to them that for the want of a horseshoe, the kingdom could be lost. And in India, we had a huge anti-corruption movement. On the heels of that, we elected in a prime minister who is narrowing down our rights at many different levels, from stalking and surveillance to cutting of midday meals for children, to closure of 42,000 schools for poor kids, to selling land to people to make huge factories and things, and displacing people. So there's a huge, burning of books, banning of books, killing of poets. Lots of things are going on in India which we did not expect and never expected would happen in India. And we just thought we were voting out people who were not so efficient and were corrupt. So, we have to really think about, when we vote in someone who's irrational, what are the decisions they can make? Because that's what the millennials don't know, the sense of history, that what is the impact. And many of them, when you talk to them, just ask them to look at a Wikipedia page and say that what are the 4 classical things that fascists do. And it's very simple to explain it to them, that they hark back to a glorious past which never existed. So Trump keeps talking about Make America Great. But which point in America?
Yes.
We still don't know.
Segregated America.
Yeah, we don't know which, so he never gives that reference. Then he always, fascists always say, they have this fear of someone from the outside, and they're going to come and do something. But again, who is that person? What will they do when America has always prospered on trade? Always dealing with, in different kinds of partnerships and relationships with different countries. So again, what is that fear, and who will come and do what? We don't know. The third characteristic of fascism, of course, is bloodletting and scapegoating. And Trump keeps talking about making a war and saying he's got a secret plan which he will only share with generals. And that itself is kind of scary, because, is he going to endorse Putin walking into Ukraine, and are they going to do this to different countries? And, we have 20 vets who commit suicide every day. So at what cost? And someone who's irrational, what will they think? So we really have to connect the dots for the millennials to make them understand that fascism is not just a term which existed in Germany, but it has deep-reaching implications for generations to come, and what can happen if we vote in someone like him just because we are angry with some other party for not doing enough.
Absolutely. I'm so thank you, panel, and we have a few minutes for questions. So imagine yourself all as de Tocquevilles, and where's the first question? Right there.
I have a question for Mr. Lam. Do you recall in 1975 when you came to California, what Governor Brown told the Vietnamese population?
Well, he didn't talk to us directly, but but he actually being very left, didn't want refugees to come to California because he believed that all Vietnamese, his phrase was something along that, but they're a family of corrupted people and children of prostitutes. Because of the very leftover attitude about, influenced by the media coverage of Vietnam at that time. And he had to later on, many years later, after Vietnamese settled in California en masse and become politicians and scientists and lawyers, had to actually publicly apologize for his statement many, many years later.
So what we're seeing today with Mr. Trump,
huh?
What we're seeing with Mr. Trump right now,
he sounded very Trump-like back then.
It's the same thing.
Right.
Front row.
Hi. Two things just quickly. Out of Austin, even Texas, we have Jim Hightower, the Hightower Lowdown. And his most recent communication was about the fact that the Koch brothers cabal are working to take over state governments all over the country here. And they're doing this irregardless of what happens at the top and the attention to the top. And it's a very frightening and perceptive take on what's happening, okay? Because people ignore this dark money influence on our state and local governments. And the second thing, just quickly, I was very, very privileged to see Gloria Steinem here in town recently and to have her wonderful book, My Life on the Road by Gloria Steinem. But I asked her to update an article she did many years ago that is so relevant to today. The Nazi connection, authoritarianism begins at home. And so I recommend people look at this book. It's amazingly small paperback, but there's just so much in it, insights every which way. So thank you for being here today.
I just want to respond to that. There's a book which I've edited of Gloria's essays, which is downstairs, and it has that chapter, if Hitler were alive, whose side would he be on? And so you can find it in the bookstore downstairs. It's called The Essential Gloria Steinem Reader. And that essay is really worth reading.
I'll make a quick comment on the Koch brothers et al. We focus on the national election as we should, but it is by far the most important thing. Don't ever underestimate that. But yeah, for the last 10 years or so, the far right wing has gotten really smart and frankly outsmarted and outspent everybody else. And the action has been at the state level and at the local level and at school boards and in states where they elect judges. At that level too, and we've seen it because this is where I do talk to people from around the country. You see this in states like North Carolina, which for many years was a pretty progressive, wonderful place, and in the last 2 years they've turned back the clock about 50 years because they elected a bunch of right-wing Republican state legislators. So although right now there's no question that massively most important is the presidential election and I guess the US Senate, a lot of us have taken our eye off the ball at the lower levels, and a lot of the day-to-day work gets done at those levels, and it makes a big difference.
So what would Tocqueville think about if he saw the road warrior movies of armored pickup trucks with exotic weaponry in the hands of individual citizens, or vampires of walking dead going after young people that are still alive and wanting to convert them? It seems as though or science fiction of fighting off all those alien invaders that are coming to take America or the world.
Anyone want to comment, Andrew?
Not really. I'm really scared at this point.
Next question.
So how is the two-party system, or this kind of, there's only two ways to go in US politics working for the US?
What's the question? How's the two-party system
working?
Yes. Who wants to take this on? It doesn't seem to be working very well. It seems like everything's imploding. But who wants to take this on?
I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for Hillary if she gets elected, is how is she going to work her way through the Congress, what is she going to do with the judiciary, which is the challenge Obama faced. So it's good that there are two parties, it's good there's a debate, it's good there are other parties too who raise issues which can influence agendas of parties.
Not really, right? I mean, so my question was like, just a follow-up. My question was like, do any of you think that that's a good thing for democracy to have just two parties and not have, like, you always have to put ideas or voices in just one of the two buckets? Is that a good thing for democracy, or you think that
do you want to go to a parliamentary system and have coalitions? Is that your question? Do you think that's better?
It's hard to imagine this country with a parliamentary system, I must say. That would be a pretty big shock to the workings. I don't know. I mean, you can look at parliamentary systems around the world that seem to work, and you can certainly look at a lot of them that don't work at all. They are so fractured, and they give power to tiny minorities.
Israel.
Because, you know, they've got 3 votes and they control what the government does. Or, you know, or Italy, which changes governments every 4.5 hours. You know, so it's really hard to say. Does it work in some of the Northern European democracies? Yeah, it does. They also are smaller and they have very homogeneous populations and kind of very different cultures and very different histories. So I don't think you can just assume that if you swapped out the current system because it's not working very well, that this other system would magically work better. I don't see that. I think we can fix our current system, and of course the simplest way to fix it at the moment is get the money out of it.
We have time for one more question on the second row.
Hello, I'm visiting from India, so I don't really know much about things as they happen here, but I'm very pleasantly surprised that, you know, even the moderator has a firm viewpoint and the whole audience seems to agree. Whereas in India, if a moderator put out a certain point of view, she would be booed by a large section of the audience. So I'm just wondering, I mean, is this only because this is Boulder, or is it, yes? Okay.
Aren't we all so desperate in this country we've come to this, right?
Well, I just want to add, I mean, just like a last minute thought, but that I feel that we don't take our democracy so much for, I mean, we take it for granted in a way, because, you know, so many countries, including the homeland that I left behind, Vietnam, there are so many people aspire to be democratic. You know, some monoparty system there under communist rule. And for a long time, activists there look toward America as a kind of shining beacon, as a potential system in which they might have. And yet, you know, we might be screwing it up really badly at some point. And that will be a kind of a defeat for so many aspiring countries that are under authoritarian rule that were hoping to develop a system in which they can self-rule. And I don't know if we fail to self-rule here, what that repercussion would be for so many countries that are trying.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations.